He walked in wearing jeans and a ball cap. Nobody knew he was the new police chief. Within 10 minutes, a white officer spit in his face. What followed would shake the entire department. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. If you believe in justice, real leadership, and what happens when power gets challenged, watch till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more truth that hits hard. On a heavy-skied Monday morning in early September, the kind that clings to your skin with humidity and tension, Malcolm Hart stepped out of his old, dusty sedan in a cracked parking lot behind the North Hill Police Precinct. Nothing about him said "Chief." He wore a soft, weathered t-shirt that had seen too many summers, a pair of jeans that had faded from deep blue to pale ash, and scuffed sneakers that barely whispered when they hit the pavement. A charcoal gray ball cap shadowed his eyes that had spent 22 years navigating the full spectrum of law enforcement, from foot patrol to federal investigations. But today, those same eyes weren't seeking criminals. They were watching culture, that invisible current that runs through a department and shapes everything from tone to truth. Malcolm had been appointed as the new chief of North Hill barely 10 days earlier. A small, mid-sized town tucked in Tennessee's Appalachian edge, North Hill was the kind of place that prided itself on being good folks, good values. But those words rang hollow to many of the Black and Latino residents who called it home. Whispers about the precinct had surfaced long before his appointment. Officers mocking civilians, turning body cams off. Complaints that vanished. It was the kind of culture that wore a clean uniform and smiled for press conferences, but rotted behind closed doors. Malcolm didn't come to be liked. He came to uncover the rot. That's why he didn't send a memo. Didn't announce a meet and greet. Didn't walk through the front door flanked by brass and applause. No, he chose the back parking lot, unannounced and invisible. Just a man in street clothes, walking into a building where no one knew he was their new boss. From the moment he stepped inside, the air told him everything. The walls, yellowed and lined with outdated notices, hummed with casual conversation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering in protest. The front desk sat unmanned. Phones rang into the void. It wasn't chaos, it was comfort. The comfort of people who believe they are not being watched. That was exactly what Malcolm had come for. He moved slowly through the hallway, absorbing every detail. On his right, a trio of officers leaned back in their chairs at the break room table, their legs sprawled out like they owned the floor. One of them, a lanky man with a southern drawl and a beard like overgrown wire, chuckled as he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Damn, did you see that boy we pulled over yesterday? Said he was late for work at the auto shop. Told him maybe next time he shouldn't be driving a car that costs more than his mama's rent." The others laughed. Not a chuckle, a roar. Malcolm stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing. They were talking about a civilian. A young black man, probably, based on the tone. No discretion, no shame. The joke wasn't just at the young man's expense. It was a signal that here, ridicule wasn't an accident. It was currency. He moved on. By the lockers, two officers, one white, one Latino, spoke in lowered tones. Their body language stiffened slightly as they noticed Malcolm pass. One gave a half glance and muttered, "New maintenance guy, maybe." The other shrugged. "Looks like someone who wandered in off the street." Malcolm made no effort to correct them. He wanted the full experience, wanted to hear what they said when they thought power wasn't listening. At the dispatch window, an older officer leaned over the counter, flirting poorly with the receptionist, who rolled her eyes behind a forced smile. In the corner, a rookie tapped his phone and grinned as he scrolled through what Malcolm guessed was a meme or video. This wasn't a workplace preparing for the arrival of new leadership. This was a clubhouse. And nobody noticed the quiet man in street clothes who was watching everything. He caught phrases in passing that made his chest tighten. They should know better than to walk through here like they own it. We got another Juan trying to play lawyer in intake. She said she was scared, but you know the type, always dramatic. Every sentence was a dagger in disguise, jokes wrapped in malice, normalized and passed off as casual banter. Malcolm said nothing. His face gave nothing away. But inside, he felt the cold, familiar pressure of anger. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that sharpens into purpose. He stopped by the vending machines, pretending to decide between a soda and a bottle of water, and used the reflective glass to study the bullpen. Laughter rang out again, this time sharper, meaner. One officer stood mimicking a panicked voice, gesturing with exaggerated flails. The others clapped like he was performing stand-up. When Malcolm turned to see who they were mocking, he noticed a thin black man in intake cuffs being led down the corridor, head lowered in shame. The timing wasn't coincidence. The cruelty was intentional. This was the North Hill culture in its rawest form. Unfiltered, unaware, unashamed. Malcolm made a mental note of faces, tone, energy. These were the moments you didn't get in briefings or press statements. This was the real precinct, the version they thought only insiders could see. And that was the mistake. Because Malcolm wasn't just observing, he was measuring. Every disrespectful joke, every unchecked insult, every lazy posture was a reflection of something deeper. A system that had learned to ignore itself. He moved toward the break room slowly, just as another group began to enter. The clock ticked close to 8:30, and chatter was rising. That's when it happened. A sharp voice pierced the room. "Hey, you lost or something?" Malcolm turned. A tall white officer stepped into view. Broad chest, tight jaw, and a smirk that screamed confidence. His nameplate read, Mercer. Behind him, several officers turned their attention to the scene, amused already. "This ain't the soup kitchen, buddy. You looking for a handout?" Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply looked at Mercer, calmly, evenly. But that only agitated the man further. "You deaf or just stupid?" Mercer took a step forward. "I said get the hell out of here. We don't need strays hanging around." Before Malcolm could speak, Mercer spat directly in his face. Laughter exploded from behind him. Someone whistled. Another officer muttered something about putting these people in their place. Malcolm stood frozen, not from fear, but from calculation. Warm spit slid down his cheek. He reached into his pocket, drew out a handkerchief, and slowly wiped his face. His movements were deliberate, controlled, unapologetically human. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" he asked, voice calm as steel. Mercer scoffed. "Only the ones who don't belong." The laughter doubled, but Malcolm said nothing more. He turned and walked silently down the hallway toward the main office. His heart was pounding, but not with shame. With certainty. They had no idea. In 10 minutes, everything was about to change. And every single person in that room was about to realize just how dangerous their assumptions had become. The room was still laughing when Malcolm Hart turned away. Not flinching, not correcting, not revealing. Officer Blaine Mercer's spit still clung to the side of his face, the last drop of it settling near his jawline like punctuation at the end of a long, ugly sentence. The sting wasn't physical. It was something sharper, symbolic, historic, expected. And yet, in that moment, Malcolm didn't react with rage or indignation. He simply took out his handkerchief, soft white cotton folded into a perfect square, and wiped the evidence clean with a grace that only experience could provide. Behind him, the laughter raged like a cheap fire. Officers leaning against the break room counters slapped their thighs, their amusement raw and unfiltered. One of them wheezed through a joke about needing to mop up the street trash, while another joked that maintenance must be cutting corners these days. Blaine Mercer stood in the center of it all, tall and smug, his hands on his hips, his voice loud enough for everyone in the precinct to hear. See, this is what happens when the wrong people get too comfortable. You gotta check them, every time. The way Mercer said it, the wrong people, wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, performed, broadcasted, and it was the kind of remark that might be followed by a laugh in some places or a quiet nod in others. But here, in North Hill, it earned applause, because in that room, in that moment, they thought they were untouchable. They believed that this quiet black man in street clothes was just another nobody. Another reminder of the invisible people they'd been conditioned to dismiss, control, or mock. But they were wrong. So wrong. Malcolm Hart didn't respond. Not with words, not with confrontation. He let the silence between them expand like a storm cloud. He turned his back on Mercer, not out of weakness, but to spare the department the kind of destruction that might come from a man like him letting loose in a place like that. Instead, he walked away, calmly, through a corridor he already knew by blueprint, but now understood by culture. He passed bulletin boards lined with missing memos, motivational posters curling at the corners, and duty rosters that had long since become routines. Everything about this place felt comfortable, unchallenged, unchanging. But that was about to end. He made his way toward the main office suite, heart steady, mind clear. Every second brought him closer to the staff meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock. And now, with Mercer's spit still freshly wiped from his cheek, that meeting wasn't just an introduction anymore. It was a reckoning. As he moved through the halls, he could feel eyes trailing him, officers whispering behind half-open doors. A few younger ones exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh, ignore, or follow the crowd. No one stopped him. No one asked if he was okay. That was the most revealing part. Because in that moment, no one saw leadership. No one saw value. No one saw humanity. They saw a man who didn't belong, and they responded the way this department had trained them to respond. With mockery, with contempt, with silence. Malcolm reached the side entrance of the briefing room just as the clock ticked to 8:58. Through a narrow pane of glass, he watched them gathering. Folding chairs squeaked under weight. Boots thudded against concrete flooring. Coffee cups steamed with the bitterness of cheap brew and long-standing habit. Some officers were still laughing from earlier, retelling the maintenance guy incident, like it was the highlight of their day. Mercer stood near the back wall, arms folded, nodding with self-satisfaction. His voice still carried, loud and arrogant. Told you, gotta keep this place clean. I mean, if you let one of them hang around too long, next thing you know, they're asking for a job. A few chuckles followed. Someone even clapped. Another leaned toward his partner and whispered something Malcolm couldn't hear, but the smirk that followed said enough. This wasn't a one-man problem. This was culture, reinforced, unchecked, and passed off as tradition. At the front of the room, Captain Glenn Roan stood, adjusting his collar and holding a folder that contained the day's agenda. Rowan was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s, known more for maintaining order than creating change. He was a lifer, safe, predictable, which made him, in some ways, just as dangerous. A man who kept the ship from sinking by ignoring the rising water. Malcolm stayed just outside the door for a moment longer, allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle into his bones. He wasn't surprised. Not exactly. You don't spend 2 decades in American policing, as a black man, without learning to read the room before you enter it. But this was different. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a bad apple. This was system failure. And Malcolm now had the clearest picture possible of what he was truly up against. The humiliation, the laughter, the spit, all of it was a gift. Painful, necessary, clarifying. He stepped back from the window, took a slow breath, and opened his own folder. Inside was the speech he had planned to give. Notes about vision, policy shifts, trust building, and accountability frameworks. He glanced at it once more, then slowly tore the page in half and dropped it into the trash can nearby. Whatever was coming next wouldn't be read from a script. It would come from somewhere far deeper, somewhere earned. He straightened his back. His hand reached up and pulled off the ball cap, revealing short-cropped salt and pepper hair. He adjusted his posture, not into character, but into truth, and walked toward the entrance. In less than 2 minutes, the entire department would learn who he really was. And they would remember the moment their world turned upside down, not because of a speech or a scandal, but because a man they spit on walked into the room as their leader. The reckoning had begun. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door to the briefing room creaked open, and Malcolm Hart stepped inside. Not the man they had mocked, but the man they were about to answer to. He entered without rush, without apology, and without flinching. His worn sneakers squeaked softly against the concrete floor, the only sound in a room that had gone suddenly and completely silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter evaporated. Coffee cups hung motionless in mid-air. Officer Blaine Mercer, who only minutes ago had been the loudest voice in the room, now stood motionless near the back wall, arms still folded, but his face beginning to shift. Slowly, uneasily. Malcolm didn't look at him. Not yet. He walked to the side of the room, now carrying a navy blue folder bearing the official North Hill Police Department seal. The same room that had moments earlier been filled with smug confidence and inside jokes now held a different energy. A vacuum of breath. A stillness that only arrived when power entered unexpectedly. Real power. Not barked orders or bloated egos, but presence. Weight. Authority rooted in truth. Captain Glenn Rowan cleared his throat awkwardly at the front of the room, clearly sensing the shift. "All right, let's settle down," Rowan said, though the room was already frozen. Today's briefing includes an important introduction. As many of you know, Chief Whitman officially retired last month, and after a lengthy process, the City Council and Commissioner have confirmed our new Chief of Police. He glanced toward Malcolm, now standing just inside the frame of the room's front. Every officer's eyes were on him now. Some confused, some curious, a few beginning to realize. "I'd like to formally introduce Chief Malcolm Hart." The words struck like a lightning bolt. You could feel it. The collective inhalation, the hard swallow of guilt, the ripple of recognition spreading like an oil slick through the room. Jaws slackened, backs straightened. Mercer's smirk disintegrated so fast it was as if it had never existed. His face flushed from a smug tan to a ghostly red. His arms, once crossed with arrogance, now slowly dropped to his sides, as if trying to erase the very posture he had claimed moments earlier. Malcolm walked toward the front, each step heavy with intention, his folder tucked under one arm, his gaze level and unwavering. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to say anything dramatic. His presence alone said enough. He stopped behind the podium, placed the folder gently down, and looked up at the men and women before him. Some couldn't meet his gaze. Others stared, wide-eyed, as if trying to reverse time with disbelief. Mercer looked like a man standing in front of a slow-moving train with nowhere to run. Malcolm didn't blink. "Good morning," he said, voice steady. "My name is Malcolm Hart. As of this morning, I am your new Chief of Police." Not a breath moved. When I arrived at this precinct today, I didn't come through the front door with fanfare or introductions. I came as an ordinary man, In jeans, a shirt, a ball cap. Just a face, nothing more. I did that because I didn't want the polished version of this department. I wanted the truth. The silence was suffocating, and what I found in under 30 minutes was a culture built not on service, but on arrogance. A culture where respect is conditional, where cruelty passes as comedy, where those who think they have power weaponize it against anyone who seems, even slightly, beneath them. He paused, letting the weight settle. Mercer stared at the floor now, his earlier bravado melted down to shame and sweat. "Let me tell you what I saw," Malcolm continued. "I saw officers laughing at civilians they pulled over. I saw a black man being mocked as he was escorted down a hallway. I heard slurs veiled as jokes, and I witnessed a moment where a fellow human being was spat on and told to leave by one of your own." Several heads turned toward Mercer now, some in disbelief, others in disgust. Malcolm didn't name him yet. He didn't need to. The room already knew. "That moment wasn't just about disrespecting a stranger," Malcolm said, his voice rising ever so slightly. "It was about revealing what this department has come to believe about power, about race, about who belongs." He let his gaze slowly move across the room now, scanning every face. Some flushed with guilt, some pale with realization, a few hardened with resentment. "If you're sitting here wondering how we got to this point, let me make it clear. We trained ourselves to ignore decency, to reward silence, to punish those who speak up. That ends today." He turned his eyes now, deliberately, to Mercer. The room followed. "Officer Mercer," Malcolm said with chilling calm. Mercer looked up, lips trembling slightly. The man who spat with such confidence barely 10 minutes ago was now a shadow of that arrogance. "When you humiliated me this morning, you didn't just disgrace a stranger," Malcolm continued. "You disgraced the badge, the oath, the very idea of what this department claims to stand for." Mercer opened his mouth, a pathetic attempt to speak, but Malcolm cut him off. "Don't," he said sharply. "You didn't care to know who I was. You didn't think for a second that maybe the man in front of you mattered, because your training didn't teach you to pause. It taught you to dominate, to assume. And that is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the people it claims to protect." A flicker of movement. One officer shifted in their seat. Another looked down at their hands. "What happened this morning wasn't an accident," Malcolm said. "It was the result of a culture, one that's been allowed to fester. And I didn't come here to maintain it. I came here to end it." He stepped slightly to the side of the podium now, his stance wider, voice deeper. "From this day forward, this precinct will operate under a new standard, one of dignity, respect, and accountability. I won't tolerate mockery disguised as camaraderie. I won't ignore injustice because it's dressed in uniform. And if you can't adjust to that, you won't last here." The words struck hard. Some officers fidgeted, some looked up, defiant. But the tone of the room had changed. The tension now wasn't from laughter, but from realization. Malcolm returned to the center of the podium. "If you came here this morning expecting business as usual," he said, "let me remind you, this is not yesterday's department, and I am not yesterday's chief." And then, with one final breath, he reached for the folder and closed it. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about integrity. And today, that integrity has a name." He stepped back from the podium, nodded once to Captain Roan, and turned his gaze one last time to the room of stunned, silent officers. They would never forget this moment, and neither would he. The silence in the room thickened after Malcolm Hart stepped back from the podium, his final words hanging in the air like smoke after a controlled burn. The officers sat stiffly, pinned in their chairs by a weight heavier than discipline. Truth. And in the back of the room, where Swagger once stood tall, Officer Blaine Mercer now shrank behind a mask of false composure. His jaw clenched so tight, it looked carved from stone. But there was no stone left in him now. Only fear, and the slow, creeping understanding that his world had just shifted beneath him. Malcolm didn't pause long. He turned deliberately toward Captain Roan, giving him the briefest nod before facing the room once more. His voice, calm and resonant, cut through the stillness with surgical precision. "Effective immediately," he said. "Officer Mercer is suspended pending an internal investigation." Gasps broke like shattered glass around the room. A few officers stiffened. One or two turned, eyes wide, toward Mercer, who blinked as if he'd been slapped for the first time in his life. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His skin turned a blotchy red, eyes darting from Malcolm to Roan and back again, as though searching for an escape hatch in a room with no doors. "You're suspending me?" Mercer finally stammered. "You can't be serious. I didn't even know who you were." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but clarity. "Exactly," he said. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to. That's the point." Another wave of silence rippled through the room, heavier this time, like a curtain falling after a performance no one applauded. You assumed that the man in front of you didn't matter. And in doing so, you exposed not just your own prejudice, but the permissiveness of a department that allowed that prejudice to thrive unchecked. He let the words settle before stepping away from the podium and walking a few slow steps forward, his presence deliberate and commanding. His voice didn't rise, it deepened, grounded in conviction. This is not about vengeance. It's not personal. It's about standards. It's about the oath we swore to uphold. It's about what we become when we abandon the very people we're supposed to protect. Mercer shifted uncomfortably. His shoulders, once squared in pride, now sagged beneath the weight of his own arrogance. Malcolm stopped just a few feet from him. "You, Officer Mercer, are not just a man who crossed a line," he said, each word sharp and precise. "You are the line, the one this department has danced around for far too long." Mercer opened his mouth again, but Malcolm raised a hand, not to silence him, but to cut through the last threads of excuse. "And let me be clear for the rest of you," Malcolm said, turning to the room. "This suspension is not a warning. It's a statement. The era of unchecked authority, of locker room cruelty, of silent complicity, it ends today." Some officers looked down. Others looked up, uncertain, rattled, and suddenly unsure of where they stood in the shifting hierarchy. A few leaned forward, sensing something they hadn't felt in years. Real accountability. Malcolm returned to the center of the room and planted his feet firmly. For too long, police culture in this country, and in this very building, has allowed certain voices to speak louder than others. Allowed misconduct to be renamed as mistakes. Allowed systemic bias to be laughed off as personality. He lifted his chin. "That stops now." Every syllable rang with finality. "From this day forward, we will begin a top-to-bottom internal review. I want complaint files, body cam audits, intake patterns, and racial disparity metrics on my desk by the end of this month. No exceptions. No redactions." He looked toward Captain Roan. "That includes every personnel report on Officer Mercer and every supervisor who overlooked them." Roan gave a stiff nod. Even he wasn't immune anymore. "We will begin mandatory bias training within the next 30 days, Malcolm continued. "Not because it looks good on paper, but because we can't correct what we refuse to confront." He took a step forward again, voice firm but never raised. "And this department will open its doors to the community. Public forums, ride-alongs, outreach sessions, starting next month. They will see what we do. They will speak to us, and we will listen. Not with defensiveness, but with humility. The room was now fully still, not with fear, but with realization. Some officers leaned in, not out of duty, but curiosity. Could this be real? Was change actually happening? Malcolm looked out across them all. Officers hardened by years of habit, rookies molded by silence, and a handful who had long since given up believing that this place could ever be anything more than survival. "Let me be crystal clear," he said. "This is not a cleanup. This is a rebuilding. If you are here to serve with dignity, to protect with fairness, to lead with courage, you will find a home here." He paused, letting the moment expand. "But if you are here to bully, to belittle, to hide behind a badge, then you are in the wrong room, and you will not remain in it for long." Officer Mercer, now pale and sweating, looked as though he might collapse. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one doing the controlling. He wasn't holding the rules. The rules had turned on him. Malcolm let his eyes pass over Mercer one final time, and then returned to the room as a whole. "We don't get to choose who walks through the doors of this precinct," he said, "but we get to choose how we treat them. That is where trust begins. And right now, this department has none." He looked toward the door now, folder still in his hands. "Trust must be earned," he said, "and starting today, we will earn it, step by step, truth by truth." He paused at the threshold of the briefing room, then turned. "You wanted leadership? You've got it. But understand, leadership comes with standards, and I will hold you to every one." Then he walked out, leaving behind not just a stunned room, but a line in the sand, clear, immovable, and drawn in the name of justice. The ripple became a wave by the next morning. What had happened in that briefing room, Mercer's humiliation, the public suspension, and Malcolm Hart's bold declaration of reform, was no longer confined to the precinct's walls. It had leaked, like gasoline on hot pavement, out into the town of North Hill. By sunrise, the phones in the front office were ringing, not with emergencies, with opinions, loud ones, divided ones, and the pushback had begun. Malcolm sat at his desk just after 6:30 a.m., the early sun barely stretching across the blinds, when Captain Roan stepped in holding a stack of printed emails. His expression was tight, unreadable. "You'll want to see this," he said, setting the pages down. Malcolm scanned them quickly. Most were from officers in the department, some anonymous, others boldly signed. A few praised him, thanking him for finally addressing what they called the elephant no one talked about. But most were critical, harsh, defensive. "You embarrassed a decorated officer in front of the entire department over a misunderstanding. You're turning this place into a political stage. Real leadership doesn't start with shame. And the most common thread, you're making this racial." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. There it was, the inevitable backlash, the twisting of clarity into controversy, the shifting of blame. Not on the culture that had festered for years, but on the man who had dared to name it. By 8 a.m., the police union had released a formal statement expressing concern over the chief's handling of Officer Mercer's suspension. They called it a hasty overreach, an act of public humiliation, and inconsistent with due process. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. A grainy photo of Malcolm, taken from a security camera, him walking down the hallway in plain clothes, flashed across screens with the caption, "New Chief Sparks Controversy After Officer Suspension." Malcolm wasn't surprised. He was prepared. He had known this wasn't going to be a clean ride. You don't uproot years of institutional rot without shaking a few trees hard enough to stir up the hornets. Still, The speed and venom of the pushback gave him pause. Mercer, not wasting time, filed an official appeal with the help of the police union's legal team. He claimed the suspension violated departmental protocol and was based on personal bias, not objective conduct. His version of events painted himself as confused, not malicious, defensive, not discriminatory. "I didn't know who he was," Mercer's appeal read. "Had I known, I'd have shown respect." The words enraged Malcolm not because of their tone, but because of what they revealed. Respect was conditional, power-based, performative. The community, meanwhile, was no quieter. Talk radio lit up with callers, half-hailed Malcolm as a necessary force of change, a man with backbone, finally holding police accountable. The other half called him an outsider, too aggressive, divisive, or dangerously political. Town Facebook groups flooded with debate, screenshots, half-truths, and long, angry threads. At noon, a small group of citizens stood outside the precinct with handwritten signs. "Support Chief Hart. Justice in uniform. No more Mercer mindsets." They were loud. They were passionate. They were met across the street by an opposing crowd holding their own signs. Back the badge. Due process for officers. And the ever-familiar, "He's just playing the race card." North Hill had cracked wide open. And then, just past 3 p.m., the first threat came. It arrived as a plain envelope on Malcolm's desk. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, printed in bold black font. "If you like your face, you might want to shut your mouth." No name, no signature, no fingerprints. Just intent. Captain Rowan called in the department's internal affairs officer, and Malcolm was advised to notify federal authorities. But he didn't flinch. He had dealt with worse in bigger cities, under more hostile lights. This, to him, was just confirmation. Confirmation that he had struck the right nerve. By the end of the week, there were 3 more letters, 1 voicemail, and an untraceable email with a photoshopped image of Malcolm's face superimposed over a burning badge. Some officers walked past him without speaking now. A few saluted with exaggerated sarcasm. The temperature in the building had changed. It wasn't heat, it was friction. And friction meant movement. Malcolm called an emergency department-wide meeting for Friday morning. No agenda, no speeches, just him, standing at the front, eyes level, voice sharp. "You think this is about one officer," he began, "but it's not. It's about what this department tolerates, what it excuses, what it laughs at when the door is closed." He scanned the room. Tired faces, resentful ones, a few open, still listening. "Yes, I suspended Officer Mercer," he said plainly, "because he spit in a man's face. And the only reason any of you are shocked is because for once someone finally called it out instead of covering it up." Someone scoffed from the side of the room. Malcolm turned. "If that bothers you," he said, "you're free to resign. Today. Right now." No one moved. "But if you're still here tomorrow," he continued, "understand what that means. It means you are agreeing to be part of this reform, whether it's comfortable for you or not." A long, hollow silence. "You don't have to like me," he said, "but you will respect the badge and the people we serve, starting now." And with that, he left the room. No applause, no fanfare, just footsteps and resolve. Back in his office, Malcolm closed the door and sat in the quiet. He stared at the stack of union letters and anonymous threats like they were trophies of war. They didn't scare him. They grounded him. Because you don't face fire like this unless you're burning down something that needed to fall. Change had made its entrance, and it wasn't asking for permission. The storm had not passed, but the sky had started to shift. A full week after Officer Mercer filed his appeal, and days after Malcolm Hart received his third anonymous threat, Something unexpected happened. A knock. Soft, hesitant, but intentional. It came just after 7 in the evening, when most of the precinct had cleared out, and the hallways echoed with cleaning carts and late-shift dispatch chatter. Malcolm sat at his desk, surrounded by files, complaint reports, internal review notes, and outlines for the department's first community roundtable. His eyes were tired, but his spine was straight. The knock came again, and then the door creaked open. Officer Tanya Ruiz stepped in, the light from the hallway catching the edge of her badge like a question mark. "Chief," she said softly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" She was young, barely 26, with sharp eyes and a quicker instinct than most gave her credit for. But she had learned early what it meant to blend in. Keep your head down. Laugh when others laugh. Nod when others sneer. Stay invisible. That's how she'd survived North Hill. Malcolm nodded and gestured to the chair across from him. Tanya stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and sat. For a moment, she said nothing, just stared down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," she finally whispered. "About culture. About what we let slide." Malcolm leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk, eyes locked on hers. "Go on." She hesitated, then spoke quickly, like pulling off a bandage. "When Mercer spat in your face, I laughed." Her eyes didn't rise. They stayed on the floor, shame clinging to every syllable. "I laughed because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. Because I didn't want to be the one who stood out. Because I've seen what happens to people who speak up in this place." Malcolm was quiet. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rescue her from the weight of her admission. He let her sit in it. Because that space between guilt and courage, that's where real change starts. "And now I feel like crap," she added, voice cracking. "But I also don't want to keep living in fear. I want to do better. I don't know how." Malcolm nodded slowly, then reached for a small notebook on the edge of his desk. "You just did," he said. Tanya blinked. "You showed up," Malcolm continued. "You didn't hide behind a memo. You didn't wait for someone else to say it first. You walked in here, alone, and told the truth. That's not weakness. That's leadership." Her eyes welled, and she quickly wiped them with her sleeve. "What do I do now?" Malcolm smiled gently. "You lead by example," he said. "Not with guilt, but with courage." She nodded, unsure but lighter than when she walked in. Before she left, Malcolm handed her a printed schedule. "We're starting a working group. Internal reform, early stages. I want you in it." She looked surprised. "Really? You just proved you belong there." She took the paper, clutched it like a lifeline, and left the office. And that was how it began. By the following Tuesday, another knock came. This time, it was Officer Derek Monroe, tall, broad-shouldered, and quiet. He had a reputation for keeping to himself, but Malcolm had noticed the way Derek's eyes lingered during meetings. He was listening, processing, measuring. "Mind if I come in, Chief?" "Door's open." Derek stepped in and closed it behind him. "I've been watching," he said. "Everything that's happening. Mercer, the union, the threats." Malcolm studied his face. There was no fear there, just deliberation. "I've been here 6 years," Derek said, "and I've seen some things. Stuff that never made it into reports. Things people joked about, but that didn't feel funny." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But I stayed quiet, told myself I was just doing my job." "And now?" Malcolm asked. "Now I realize doing my job isn't enough." The words hung in the air. Strong, simple, true. "What are you willing to do?" Malcolm asked. "Whatever it takes," Derek said, "even if it means losing friends in the process." Malcolm didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Good," he said, "because I'm building something that needs people like you." Derek nodded, turned, and walked out. By the end of the week, Malcolm had 5 names on his list. All younger officers. All had privately come forward. Some through email. Some through quiet hallway conversations. All of them said the same thing in different ways. We've had enough. Enough silence. Enough complicity. Enough pretending that the Mercer incident was a fluke. They knew better. And now, they wanted to be better. Malcolm didn't announce the group publicly. Not yet. He called it the Core 5. They met on Thursdays at 7 p.m., off-duty, in a conference room that overlooked the community garden behind the station. There were no uniforms in those meetings, no ranks, just ideas, reflection, resolve. They talked about racial bias. They reviewed past reports. They brainstormed how to create a new onboarding protocol for incoming officers, one that emphasized dignity, communication, and de-escalation. Tanya proposed creating a peer review system. Derek volunteered to lead monthly scenario training based on real incidents. It was small, it was quiet, but it was real. And real was what Malcolm needed. Meanwhile, the noise outside the room continued. The union kept posturing. Mercer's appeal crawled through legal channels. The threats didn't stop. But now, for the first time since Malcolm's arrival, there was a pulse inside the building that didn't come from anger or fear. It came from hope. Because change doesn't always roar through the front door. Sometimes it enters as a whisper, as a knock, as a confession from someone who laughed because she was scared, and who now refuses to laugh anymore. Malcolm understood this was just the beginning. He wasn't naive. He knew there were still officers waiting for him to fail. Still closed doors where jokes were told too quietly for HR to hear. But now, there were also people who believed, who stepped forward, who chose courage over comfort. And that was enough to keep going. Because sometimes the loudest change begins with the quietest voices finally choosing to speak. The tide turned the day the file landed on Malcolm Hart's desk. It was a thick, weathered binder labeled Mercer Personnel, Internal, retrieved from the locked archives by an officer who had once been too afraid to ask questions. Malcolm opened it slowly, like peeling back the lid of a time capsule no one wanted to admit existed. What spilled out was not a misunderstanding, not a lapse in judgment, not an isolated incident as Mercer and the police union insisted. It was a pattern, cold, undeniable, and decades in the making. Inside were 17 formal complaints filed over the past 9 years against Officer Blaine Mercer. 17. The earliest dated back to the spring of 2016, involving a traffic stop where a Latino teenager was pulled from his car, handcuffed, and left in the rain for 30 minutes while Mercer searched for attitude. The boy had no prior record, no weapon, just brown skin, and a car stereo playing too loud apparently. Another complaint, from 2019, described Mercer cornering a female civilian during a noise complaint call, commenting on her body and threatening arrest if she didn't tone down the attitude. The department had marked the incident as inconclusive. No body cam footage, no follow-up interview. The deeper Malcolm read, the clearer it became. Mercer wasn't a bad apple. He was a protected rot, buried under layers of indifference, redacted forms, and supervisors who stamped the word resolved on unresolved misconduct like it was an auto-response. By the time Malcolm reached the end of the file, his hands were trembling, not with rage, but with confirmation. The questions were no longer if or why, but how deep, how long, and how many others had helped keep it quiet. He didn't wait. Within 48 hours, he ordered a full internal audit of every disciplinary file from the last 15 years. It was unprecedented. Captain Rowan raised an eyebrow but didn't object. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe guilt. Maybe the realization that change was no longer optional. The review uncovered more than anyone expected. 7 officers had multiple complaints that were never escalated beyond their sergeants. 3 supervisors had signed off on falsified reports. 1 complaint about Mercer's use of excessive force during a 2020 Black Lives Matter protest had been lost in clerical transition. The civilian, a 22-year-old student named Lamar Jennings, had a fractured wrist and 2 broken ribs. He'd filed the report twice. No one followed up. Worse still, Malcolm discovered that Mercer had served for 18 months as a field training officer, mentoring younger recruits and passing down his methods like a disease disguised as doctrine. Tanya Ruiz had been one of them. She wept when she saw her own name on an old partner review marked "Learning Fast, just needs to lighten up about woke stuff." Malcolm gathered every file, every redacted form, every time-stamped email where complaints were brushed aside. He stacked them on the long table in the main conference room and called a press briefing for Monday morning, 10 a.m. sharp. The room was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, recorders blinking red. Community leaders sat in the front row. Tanya and Derek stood silently near the side wall, eyes locked forward. Malcolm took the podium without notes, without a script. "North Hill deserves the truth," he began, "and this department has hidden that truth for far too long." He opened the first folder and held it up. This is a complaint from 2016. Officer Mercer unlawfully detained a minor. This report was marked "Resolved." It was not. He opened another. This one's from 2019. Harassment, buried, no investigation. He kept going. By the 10th folder, the room was silent. Journalists stopped taking notes and just stared. A few community members blinked away tears. One woman in the second row whispered, "I filed one of those." Malcolm looked out at them. This is not one man's failure. It is a systemic betrayal, a culture of silence, of protectionism, of unchecked authority. But that stops here. He announced the immediate suspension of 3 supervisors. 2 would be referred to the State Oversight Board for review. He also confirmed that Officer Mercer's appeal had been formally denied, and that an external investigation was being launched into North Hill's previous complaint handling procedures. "This isn't a purge for punishment," Malcolm said. "It's a realignment of purpose. If we are to serve this community, we must start by being worthy of its trust." That afternoon, he walked the hallways himself, folders still in hand, stopping at desks, nodding to those who had been brave enough to come forward. The precinct was quiet, but not tense. It felt like a held breath. Later that evening, in the Reform Working Group, Tanya read out a list of proposed policies to protect whistleblowers. Derek suggested a rolling audit program, an internal affairs rotation made up of officers from outside the department to prevent hometown bias. Malcolm listened, took notes, encouraged. He knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was bigger now. The truth had been excavated, and once exposed, it couldn't be reburied. But exposure came with risk. That night, a brick shattered the passenger side window of Malcolm's car. A note was duct-taped to the dashboard. "Stop digging, or you'll get buried next." Malcolm stood in the dark, staring at the broken glass, heart calm. It didn't scare him. If anything, it strengthened his spine. Because when the ground trembles, it means the fault lines are shifting. The purge was not the end. It was the beginning. The brick didn't stop him. If anything, it marked the beginning of the real work, the slow, soul-deep work that followed the fire. The truth had been aired. Files opened, names named, suspensions handed down. The town of North Hill had watched Malcolm Hart pull a curtain back on its most sacred institution, and now that the dust had settled, people weren't just angry anymore. They were watching, waiting, wondering if anything would actually change. Malcolm knew this next part wasn't about policy. It was about people. He started walking. By the end of that week, Malcolm had personally attended 3 town hall meetings, 2 church forums, and a community center panel hosted by the local NAACP chapter. He didn't come with talking points or polished speeches. He came with a chair, a pen, a yellow legal pad, and the posture of a man who was there to listen before he spoke. The first few meetings were hard. The tension in the rooms was thick, often explosive. At the North Hill Baptist Fellowship Hall, a woman stood up and pointed her finger straight at him. "We've been talking for years," she said. "You're just the first one who bothered to write anything down." At the second forum, a young black father stood and told a story about being pulled over in front of his own driveway while his children watched from the window. "You want to know why we don't trust the badge?" he said, voice cracking. "Because we've seen what it does when it thinks no one's looking." Malcolm didn't flinch. He nodded, scribbled notes. Let the pain hang in the air. Because that pain had a right to exist in daylight, not just in whispers. But not every moment was filled with fire. At a community youth event held on the cracked basketball courts behind the old high school, Malcolm found himself standing near a 15-year-old boy named Kenny, who kept stealing glances at his badge but refused to approach. Eventually, Malcolm walked over and offered him a bottle of water. Kenny took it, but said nothing. A few minutes passed before Kenny finally muttered, "You're the one who made that white cop cry, right?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow but didn't smile. "I didn't make him cry," he said. "He just finally saw the mirror." Kenny looked at him for a moment, then asked, "You really think you can fix it?" Malcolm paused. He looked around at the other kids laughing, at the volunteers passing out snacks, at the basketballs bouncing over cracked pavement. Then he looked back at Kenny. "We're not there yet," he said, "but we're trying." Kenny didn't answer, but he stayed. And later, when the volunteers asked for help stacking chairs, he was the first one to lift a hand. The moment didn't go viral. It wasn't filmed. But for Malcolm, it was everything. A small thread of trust, fragile but real, starting to stitch something new. Back at the precinct, the tone was changing too. The laughter still existed, but it had shifted. It wasn't barbed anymore. It wasn't at someone's expense. It came from shared effort. New conversations. The break room bulletin board now held notices for bias training workshops, community listening sessions, and a sign-up sheet for youth mentorship patrols. Derek Monroe had volunteered to lead the first one. Tanya Ruiz had drafted a proposal for a civilian review board, and it had passed. In one of the most unexpected turns, Officer Shanice Doyle, a formerly quiet but respected veteran, organized a potluck with community leaders and officers, hosted in the precinct parking lot. It started as an awkward mix of guarded glances and polite introductions, but by sunset, music played from portable speakers. Kids tossed footballs between patrol cars, and someone from the neighborhood had brought homemade peach cobbler. Malcolm stood at the edge of the lot, arms folded, watching. Not interfering, just observing what accountability had made possible. And then, quietly, the narrative began to shift. Local journalists who once plastered headlines with words like chaos, controversy, and power struggle began to write with a different tone. An editorial in the North Hill Times ran with the headline, "From Control to Connection. Is this the department we've been waiting for?" Another local station aired a 10-minute segment following Malcolm on foot patrol, speaking with shop owners, greeting children, and visiting a local barber shop where the owner, Mr. Langston, had once called the precinct a nest of wolves. This time, Langston shook Malcolm's hand. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day I respected someone with a badge," he said. It wasn't performative. It was earned. And it came not from Malcolm demanding trust, but from him consistently showing up to earn it. But Malcolm knew not to mistake momentum for victory. Trust was not a switch. It was soil, something you tended, watered, protected. It would take years to see full bloom. Some wounds would never close. Some residents would never return to the table. And he respected that, because this wasn't about making everyone like the department. It was about making the department worthy of being liked. Malcolm kept a photograph on his desk now. It wasn't of his family. It wasn't of him in uniform. It was a still frame from the basketball court. Kenny sitting on the bleachers, water bottle in hand, looking directly at the camera, not smiling, not posing, just looking, seeing. That photo reminded Malcolm every day. This job wasn't about proving anything to people like Mercer. It was about never failing people like Kenny. By the end of that month, the precinct's voicemail inbox had changed too. Fewer angry rants. More community event invitations. More mothers asking if an officer could speak at career day. More residents calling not to report crime, but to suggest solutions. And that, more than anything else, told Malcolm that the bridge was being rebuilt. One conversation, one apology, one moment at a time. 1 year later, the North Hill precinct breathed differently. It didn't happen overnight. Change never does. But with time, steady, uncompromising time, the station that once roared with arrogance now hummed with intention. The graffiti-scratched benches in the front lobby had been replaced. The complaint forms, once tucked behind locked drawers, now sat openly beneath a sign that read, "Your voice matters." Officers no longer smirked at civilians who asked questions. They answered them. They listened. They learned. It had been 12 months since Chief Malcolm Hart walked into that building in jeans and a ball cap, watched a man spit in his face, and drew a line so sharp it split a department in two. Now, the ripple effects of that moment had become something else entirely. A standard. The precinct wasn't perfect. No place could be. But it was different. Not in slogans or mission statements, but in tone, in energy, in the quiet things. The way officers now greeted janitorial staff by name. The way civilian complaints were responded to within 48 hours, not forgotten in inboxes. The way morning briefings began not with sarcasm, but with purpose. And perhaps most telling, the way laughter returned, not cruel, not coded, but real, honest, shared. Tanya Ruiz now wore sergeant stripes on her uniform. The day the promotion was announced, she stood in front of her fellow officers, some still older than her, some still adjusting to her authority, and said only one sentence. "I'm not here to lead by rank. I'm here to lead by what I almost stayed silent about." The room didn't applaud, they stood. Her rise was more than merit. It was redemption, proof that honesty could live past guilt, that courage could grow from regret. She was now in charge of training new recruits. The curriculum had been rewritten from the ground up. No more war stories passed off as lessons. No more us versus them language. Instead, recruits studied de-escalation, community-based response, implicit bias, and cultural competency, terms that once got eye rolls but now defined what it meant to wear the badge in North Hill. Of course, not everyone made it. Over the course of that year, 9 officers quietly resigned. Some submitted transfer requests. Others left under investigation. A few, like Mercer, fought to stay. But his time had run out. His appeal, once championed loudly by the union, was denied. Twice. The State Review Board cited a pattern of misconduct, a history of uncorrected behavior, and a final incident that displayed a clear failure to uphold the ethical standards required of law enforcement. Mercer's face no longer lingered on the bulletin board. His name, once whispered in reverence or fear, had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of what had been allowed to grow, and what would never return. Malcolm never gloated. He didn't need to. The victory wasn't in removing Mercer. It was in ensuring there would never be another Mercer given that kind of unchecked authority again. Malcolm walked the halls differently now. He never made grand entrances. No detail followed him. No one rose when he stepped into the room. He preferred it that way. He walked with his hands in his pockets, a quiet nod to those he passed. He paused often, at dispatch, in the break room, near the lockers, to ask a simple question. How are we doing? Not you, we. It mattered, because the standard wasn't about who had power. It was about who had the courage to be accountable even when no one was watching. He didn't chase perfection. He chased truth. And truth had to be nurtured. Some days were still hard. A few older officers bristled at the new systems. Community feedback wasn't always glowing. Mistakes happened. But now, when they did, they were named, not hidden, addressed, not buried. And that difference, the willingness to face failure head-on, became the new language of the department. Local media took notice. A year after their scathing coverage of Malcolm's arrival, the North Hill Times ran a front-page piece titled, "A Year of Reckoning. North Hill PD Learns to Listen." The article detailed reform milestones, but it also featured testimonials from community members. One came from Lamar Jennings, the young man whose injury report had once been lost. He was now part of the new Civilian Review Advisory Panel, helping shape disciplinary policy and bridging the divide he once feared would never close. "I didn't think they'd ever change," Lamar said in the interview. But then someone showed up who didn't flinch, and he kept showing up. Malcolm read that line twice, then folded the paper and placed it in his drawer, just beside the photo of Kenny, the quiet teenager on the basketball court who had once asked, "You really think you can fix it?" Kenny had joined the police youth mentorship program 6 months ago. Last week, he asked Malcolm if he could apply to the summer cadet internship. "Not because I love cops," he said, grinning, "because maybe now I could be one and not hate myself for it." That sentence hit harder than any accolade. In his office, Malcolm kept a board of sticky notes. No structure, no labels, just names, words, moments. Some notes marked failures, others victories. One yellow square read, "It starts with you." Tanya had written it and left it on his desk the day after her promotion. Another note, scribbled in blue pen, simply said, "He listened." It was anonymous, slid under his door after a town hall meeting. He never found out who left it. He didn't need to, because the board wasn't for display. It was a reminder that real leadership doesn't need applause. It needs consistency, humility, a spine strong enough to stand up, and a heart soft enough to bend when needed. The new standard at North Hill wasn't a policy. It was a presence, a way of moving, a way of seeing people, civilians and officers alike, not as problems, not as threats, but as mirrors. And Malcolm had spent a year holding that mirror up to everyone, himself included. Some cracked, some changed, but all of them saw something they couldn't unsee. And that was the point. 1 year. That's how long it took to begin changing a police department. Not completely, but fundamentally. And from that transformation in North Hill, there's a lesson for every American citizen watching this. Change is possible. But it does not begin at the top. It begins in truth. What Malcolm Hart showed us, what Tanya, Derek, Kenny, and even the angry voices at the town hall taught us, is that systems don't correct themselves. People do. With courage, with clarity, with consequences. When a man spit in Malcolm's face, the easy response would have been retaliation. Instead, he chose reflection, accountability, and action. He didn't demand respect. He embodied it. And that's a standard we should all expect, not just from our officers, but from our institutions, our leaders, and ourselves. For too long, we've been told that integrity and power don't go together. But North Hill proved that you can enforce the law without losing your humanity. You can rebuild trust without erasing pain. You can fire the ones who failed and still leave the door open for those ready to grow. It's not about perfection. It's about presence, about showing up. Malcolm walked the halls every day not to be seen, but to see. He listened more than he spoke. He faced threats, lawsuits, and division, and still kept walking. Because leadership is not noise, it's consistency. If you're a citizen wondering if your community could ever change, the answer is yes. If you're an officer wondering if your badge still means something, the answer is yes. But it starts with the smallest act, showing up when it would be easier to turn away, speaking when silence is the norm, choosing what's right over what's comfortable. North Hill didn't become perfect, but it became honest. And that is where every movement begins. So if this story lit a fire in you, don't let it stop here. Like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, because the more we talk about stories like this, the more we remember names like Malcolm Hart, Tanya Ruiz, and Kenny, the harder it becomes for silence to win. Change isn't coming from somewhere else. It's coming from us, from every shared video, every uncomfortable truth, every citizen who dares to demand more. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint, and we hope you carry it forward.